Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Garrett Felix, and I'd like to welcome you to the ISSA Pre-Professional Virtual Meetup. I am the Privacy Officer and Information Security Officer for Exos Metafit and currently serve on the ISSA International Board of Directors. And for today, I'll be serving as the moderator for today's event. The ISSA Cybersecurity Career Lifecycle Program is sponsoring a new series geared for the pre-professional and entry-level members, the Virtual Meetup. We'd like to provide our pre-professional and entry-level members to have the opportunity to meet experts in a given specialty of cybersecurity in an informal and relaxed venue. During the Virtual Meetup, participants can ask questions and learn firsthand what it takes to get the job, what skills are necessary, and how to obtain the skills, as well as ask any question that might help them in preparing for working towards the job in cybersecurity. We hope to continue the virtual meetups with additional guests and topics based on feedback from our pre-professional and entry-level members. Please use the hashtag ISSACSCL to tweet about this meetup. Before we begin the presentation, I would also like to share some information about scholarship opportunities that you might be interested in. The ISSA Education Foundation supports the education of the next generation of cybersecurity professionals, and with scholarships for undergraduate and graduate studies. The ISSA Education Foundation will award 3 scholarships during 2016. The E. Eugene Schultz Jr. PhD Memorial Scholarship at $3,500, the ISSA Education Foundation Scholarship at $3,500, and the ISSA Education Foundation Sean Harris Memorial Scholarship at $2,000. If you are interested in any of these scholarship opportunities, please go to the ISSA Education Foundation website at www.issaef.org for specific application dates and deadlines. At this point, I'd like to also give a chance for our panelists to introduce themselves. I have one panelist on the line right now, and we have another one hopefully joining us shortly. David, I would go ahead and pass it to you if you want to give a little bit of information about yourself, where you work, and a little bit about your bio.
Sure, thanks, Garrett. My name's Dave Wilson. I grew up in New York on Long Island and received an Army scholarship, went to law school, and then spent 20 years as a Army JAG officer in the U.S. Army. During that time frame, I did a lot of litigation, courtroom work, and then got into technology and provided legal advice to NSA and what is now Cybercom. Then I retired. Spoke to one of the other panelists here who will be on shortly and asked Mark Spencer, I said, Mark, what do I need to do to start practicing law and cybersecurity combined? And he said, go get your CISSP. And I said, okay, what's that? And he told me, and I went out, got that certification, and started my practice, Titan Info Security Group, doing cybersecurity and legal consulting, a little bit of privacy stuff. One of the topics we might get into a little bit, whether it's legal to hack back in self-defense and things like that. So that's where I am. And I'm licensed in New York, Connecticut, and Colorado.
Okay, great. Thank you. What I'll go ahead and do is I'll start, since it's just one-on-one right now, and asking you some questions. Feel free if you want to branch off in any direction that's in your area of expertise with your experience in law and even military law specifically, and the overlap into cybersecurity. Feel free. These are just baselines, so in terms of questions. Okay. One of the first questions we got asked was, what do you need to do to make sure you cover yourself during a penetration testing to be abiding by the law? So not as to get yourself in hot water.
And I've written a couple articles on this. The best thing you can do is, first of all, make sure you have that get out of jail free card. So you want something from the client saying you are allowed to do X, Y, and Z on their network. And I've seen some that were just a paragraph. I like to outline fully what it is you're going to do, whether you're on site or off site, and cover whether it's just the company and those people work for the company, or if you have subcontractors or consultants, make sure you include all those people so there's no wiggle room. You know, if for some reason you crash their network and now they're mad at you and they want to come after you for damage, you know, you just need to make sure you cover yourself. Also, I have not seen an assessment or a pen test yet that focused only on the client's network, and a client that had their network completely confined. They're always attached to somebody, so you need to make an account for the possibility that you may go outside their network or their IP range or what have you, and just include that. Discuss it with them. You know, who are you connected to? If we start banging on your network, you know, at what point may we end up outside? And obviously, this is all, if you're trying to make it realistic, you have the trusted agent within the organization, and but you got to have the people who understand what you're talking about. So it's kind of a balancing act. You don't want to bring in all the IT people or the network administrators, but on the other hand, you want people who know the network and can give you sort of the map of it and let you know where you will be and what you're looking at, IP ranges, things like that.
Okay. With what you may be able to talk about, have you seen any, in your experience, pen tests gone bad that you could maybe elaborate on a little bit, or?
I haven't seen any. I've heard about them. It's funny because the people that I've worked with, they go from extreme professional, completely white hat, to completely on the other side, claiming to be white hat, but when I've worked with them or spoken to them about what they're doing, they claim to be, well, you know, we kind of get a little bit in the gray area. And I've told them, you were way out of the gray area, you're in the black, or yeah, you're in the gray area, you're still kind of okay. But it depends on who I'm talking to. Some like to play fast and loose. Um, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks. Um, maybe you could also go into some of the people who are most of the people on this webinar are new, of course, or just looking to actually enter the field,
Mhm.
and may have seen references to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. How might that apply to cybersecurity industry in terms of them getting into it and what it really applies to?
Sure. The in my opinion, that is really the only true U.S. cybercrime law that's out there. You have some others that deal a little bit with privacy and stuff like that, but most of those you won't get into unless you're dealing with very specific issues. And the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, it gets into, well, first of all, it was written in, I believe, '86, so it's very outdated, and you can find a ton of blogs talking about that the fact that it should be updated and how it should be updated, what it should include, what it shouldn't include, things like that. The only very controversial issues that I've ever seen utilized with this law from justice was at one point there was that case, I think it was like in Ohio, where this lady imitated her daughter or imitated a teenage girl online and was telling this other girl who her daughter was in competition with for cheerleading or something, how bad she was or something, just really beating her down. And Justice took the case to California and filed it as it was a long time ago, I think exceeding authorized access or something like that, using the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and it just didn't fit. And I'm pretty sure the lady won on appeal. And one of my old professors from George Washington University, Professor Kerr, actually helped on that appeal because not because anybody liked this lady. What she did was horrible because the girl ended up killing herself. But the way they sort of turned the law around to meet their own needs just wasn't real good. And then there was the AT&T case where the I forgot the guy's name. He created software that would input one number at a time to a URL, and what they called slurping email addresses out of the AT&T network, and they claim that he violated the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act by doing that. I disagree with that. Again, Professor Kerr, he actually is helping with that appeal pro bono, because it's almost like if you were to type a wrong character into a URL and suddenly all this information showed up for you, now you could be prosecuted. So again, it was not a good use of the law. And like I said, the law was created in '86. It's way outdated, and it doesn't really apply to what we have now. But just some real quick basics. Computer under the law applies to anything connected to online. So that now means your phone, your watch, anything you have that can connect online is considered a computer. And because you're online, it's considered you can cross state lines. That's what makes it federal. And then there's the two categories I alluded to, gaining unauthorized access, which is hacking, or exceeding authorized access, which is if you're working for a company, and there's been a lot of cases similar to this, you have access to certain drives in your company. If you decide to leave, this is one thing companies need to be aware of. You need to have an exit policy. If you fire or somebody leaves the company, you need to cut their access off immediately, because they still have access to your network. And under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the courts have said if they still had access and they had it before, then that access is okay. In most cases, I've said that. There's been a few that disagree, but so the company would have to go after a theft theory versus the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in that case. So.
Okay, great. I'd like to also remind those in the audience that are listening that if you want to, you can ask questions through the Google Hangout, and as time permits, we'll try to get to as many questions as possible beyond the ones we already have. All right, so another question that popped up is holding on to data in your network legal in regards to privacy law? And I know there are retention requirements, and there are certain regulations that require retention of data for a certain period of time, but maybe you can go on and discuss this a little bit.
Yeah, I saw that, and I wasn't 100% sure what the issue was, or the real question behind that was, but I would just say, if whatever you're going to retain, and I tell clients, if whatever you're going to retain, make sure you know what you have. So do an inventory of your hardware, your software assets, as well as all the information that you have and where it's located, both within your organization and outside. And that may be if you hire an accountant, an attorney, you have an IT vendor, do they have some of your company information, whether it's client or employee, on their network? And what are they doing to protect that information? So you can't, like I've done in a lot of lectures, you can't take the castle wall effect and say, well, I protected everything within my castle. I'm not responsible for anything beyond it. You are now, which is exactly what happened to Target and the HVAC company that the hackers went through to get into Target. So you just have to know what you have and protect it as best you can. Unfortunately, what I'm seeing is most companies don't have that inventory, and a lot of them aren't even meeting the basics. I'm writing an article right now on reasonable security, and basically looking at all the class action complaints related to data breach and what the plaintiffs are claiming. It'll be a while before we'll see how courts rule, and that's another issue to get into with Title III and damages and standing and stuff. But what I'm going to show is what the plaintiffs are claiming the defendants did not do to secure information. And so far, most of it is they didn't encrypt anything, they didn't notify quickly or at all, they didn't have a good incident response plan, all the basics. So.
Okay, with at least from what I've seen in terms of the cases that have been filed after data breaches, the vast majority of them have been dismissed because the fact that damages did not occur.
Yes.
Do you see this continuing? What do you think that the the level. A lot, I know some of them they'll try to are trying to look at I'm being damaged because of the potential future damages that that could occur with my information being disclosed out there, wherever the case may be, on the dark web, being sold and bought. Do you feel that things are, from your legal, I mean, I know you can't give legal advice, I won't say it in that regards, but do you see these changing, the approaches in the courts changing in terms of their ability to actually let these cases continue and potentially rule in favor of clients for potential future damages?
Yeah, they've basically gone through sort of three generations. Like you said, they started out dismissing the cases because the plaintiffs could not make a prima facie case for damages. And then they moved to relatively recently, within the last, I would say certainly within the last year or maybe two, to where like there was, I think it was the 11th Circuit in Atlanta, stated, well, we will allow the case to proceed, but at some point you will have to show damages. And now it was within the last maybe 3 months. I believe it's the 6th Circuit, somewhere in the Midwest, I think. I may be messing that all up, but the court ruled that the plaintiff, the fact that they expended time, energy, and funds to try and prevent potential identity theft because of this breach, that was enough to show damages or potential damages, and so they're allowing them to go forward on that scenario. For me, though, yeah, I agree that companies need to be held accountable when they're not even doing the basics, and all our stuff is being lost and stolen. Personally, the way I think about it is, having been in the Army for 20 years and having all my security clearance stuff out there and now stolen from OPM, I take the stance that I have zero expectation of privacy and everything's already out there anyway. But from the legal and court perspective, I often go through a scenario. Let's say somebody's suing Walmart saying, hey, I suffered identity theft because 6 months ago or a year ago you were breached. And I would get that person on the stand, and I'm not looking to be the bad guy attorney in this. I'm just looking at this realistically. The attorney is going to ask the plaintiff, okay, how do you know that the Walmart breach was the cause of your identity theft? Well, because they were breached, I got a notice from them, therefore that's the cause of my identity theft. And then I would ask them, well, where else did you use that card in the 1 year or 2 years before Walmart's breach? Oh, Target, Home Depot, all these other places. And then I would ask them, well, how do you know they weren't breached? Well, and the plaintiff would probably say, well, I didn't get a notice from them that they were breached. Well, they were probably breached and they don't even know it. And oh, by the way, as we know, Home Depot was breached. So it's so hard to prove. I suffered identity theft because that company where I used my card once, twice, maybe 3 times was actually breached. I don't think you technically can ever make that connection, or it will be very difficult to make that connection. So there's a long road for plaintiffs to go here.
Okay, great, thanks. At this time, I'm going to I want to introduce Mark Spencer. He was able to join our webinar. Mark, if you just want to give a brief discussion, or brief talk about your background, how you got into the cybersecurity industry to our audience.
Okay, yeah, I'm Mark Spencer. I'm Colorado Springs. Right now, I'm sneaking away from a conference we're having for ISSA, but my my background is I've got about a little over 22 years in the cybersecurity field now. Currently, strangely enough, I'm working in systems engineering, but what I'm doing is actually integrating cybersecurity into the systems engineering process. for the organization I work for, and it's working out very well. I got into cybersecurity because while I was still on active duty in the Air Force, put in a network, and I had some people come down that were going to do an evaluation of it for an accreditation. And so they started asking me for things, and everything they asked for I had in one form or another. And so when I retired from the Air Force, they offered me a job in cybersecurity, and that's what I've been doing since then. And so that's basically it.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and throw this next question out to either of you. I don't know who would want to take the lead on it. Are there any certifications or training courses that I can take to learn about cybersecurity legal matters?
Well, this Mark, in terms of certifications, there are lots of certifications out there. Some of the better ones are perhaps for the entry level, more of a technical certification, Security Plus, although there are others. There's also, of course, the Certified Information Systems Security Professional, CISSP, which is much more in depth, much broader. But there are also some areas such as certified ethical hacker and things like that that deal a lot with legal activities that have to go on coincident to what you're doing. So it depends on. I don't know of any actual certifications that deal almost exclusively with the legal aspects of cybersecurity. Perhaps Dave has some more insight in that.
Yeah, I agree with Mark. There's not a specific course. They just sort of sprinkle the legal into a lot of the courses. What I would caution is that in those courses, make sure if there is really something legal that's very controversial, and typically you will get somebody asking a question, a legal question, especially in a CEH or a course like that. Make sure the person giving the answer is qualified to give that answer or really knows what they're talking about, because a lot of misinformation is spread around about what you can do and can't do. Fortunately for people who might get into legal trouble, a lot of the misinformation goes to the very conservative side. Like I mentioned earlier in the broadcast, we might get into hackback and active defense a little bit. Most people jump to the conclusion, oh, it's illegal, you can't do that. Well, that's not necessarily true. It's tricky, and you have to understand both the technical security and legal aspect of it, but I wouldn't paint it with a broad brush and say, oh, it's all illegal, you can't do it. Along those lines, I want to answer Mimi's question. She says, I'm a lawyer with a few years in land use background. I'm looking to go into cybersecurity work, possibly a cybersecurity consultant, and she wants to know, how do you acquire experience and would people hire? Like I mentioned earlier, as Mark told me when I was retiring and looking to open a company, he said, go get your CISSP. That was perfect for me because, like I said, I worked at NSA. I had a lot of technical background from all the meetings I went to, all the legal advice I had to give. I had to understand the technical aspects of a lot of different things. And so the CISSP sort of connected all those dots for me. And as I was studying, it was like, oh, that's what they meant by when they said this and that and so on and so forth. So you need to have at least a little bit of technical background. But the good thing about any certification is it's not a time thing. You can start studying now and study for 2 or 3 years until you feel comfortable with it. But just studying for those certs will give you a lot of the background that you need.
Okay, thank you. We'll go with Mark here. Mark, from your industry experience, I'm sure you've come across some people in even in management that aren't paying attention or aren't may not be doing what they they could be or should be. If the cybersecurity managers aren't really, I guess the question came across as paying attention or keeping trying to think how to put this or reword this question better, uh, but if the cybersecurity managers aren't paying attention to what needs to be done out there, what recourse do employees have to protect themselves that report to them, or are they even liable, knowing what if they see things going on from a legal perspective?
Well, it's been my experience that you will find people who pay more attention to the budget than they do the security, which I can understand their viewpoint also, but we're not there to to try to run their system. It's not our system; it's theirs. We're just there to try to protect it. About the only guarantee we can give them is they will be, penetrated. It's not a matter of if, but when. So how do you reduce the risk of that and extend that? So for the entry-level person who hasn't established their credibility with the senior managers, the best thing you could do is be very objective and document everything and present it to them. Make sure that when they make decisions, they have all the facts. If they want your recommendations, then make recommendations for them. But don't expect them to follow your recommendations. One of the things that I found over the years is that I don't tell anybody they have to do anything because they've spent a lot of time in showing me that they don't have to follow my recommendations, much to their detriment in many cases. Uh, but objectively present what the problems are, what you see the threats and the risks are, so that they can make those informed decisions. And if you do this in a formal manner, with a report, keep your copy of it, because when something happens and they come back to blame you, you can pull it out and say, look, this was the decision you made at the time, and we we let you know what was going to happen, and the possibility of it. And so it's a risk management decision. It's not our decision.
Okay, thank you. David, I'm sure some of the people, I don't know how many of the people, since it's a relatively new to the industry audience out here that are listening to us, but I'm sure you've heard a lot about the safe harbor invalidation through Max Schrems sort of became famous. He's from Austria, and there was a suit filed, if I'm not mistaken, against Facebook. And as everything played out, it ended up invalidating the safe harbor agreement that was established between the European Union and the United States to allow personal data to transfer outside the EU to the United States in a standardized manner. I know recently they announced the proposed replacement for it. If I'm not mistaken, it's called Privacy Shield. Do you have any background or information you may want to discuss with our people on the webinar today in terms of the impact of this, from a global business perspective and cybersecurity?
Sure. Yeah, let me just give a little background. The Safe Harbor Act was created because the European Union came up with privacy guidelines and laws that required anybody who held European Union citizens' personally identifiable information, PII. If anybody who held that had to comply with these laws. So U.S. companies who wanted to, had servers like Google and Yahoo, had servers overseas, and were moving data back and forth in and out of the EU, they had to comply with the EU privacy rules. And real quick, we think we have some strict privacy rules here in the U.S. They are nothing compared to the EU. When you go through the CISSP, it talks about various guidelines and rules and regulations. If you have to give, as a company, you have to give an EU citizen the ability to correct any data you have on them if they feel it is incorrect. And first of all, they have to know that that data exists. So they're very strict on that. So the the Safe Harbor Act was created here in the U.S. so companies could comply with that, but it was sort of a self-check rule. So companies would just go through and sort of like the minimal standard for PCI. They would just go through a checklist. Yeah, we did that, and say, yeah, we are compliant, without anybody really looking to see if they were. And there was a lot of violations. And I often wondered, how do people find out if a U.S. company is violating the EU privacy laws? And when I looked into it, I found out that somebody was diming those companies out and telling on them. So they were getting fined and having a lot of troubles. So when the EU started changing their privacy laws and making them more strict, and as Garrett mentioned, with some of these shakeups over these U.S. companies, the Safe Harbor Act was wiped out, and now they have a temporary fix, the EU-US Privacy Shield, but it's still waiting on final approval from the EU. So it's not 100% in place, but it's sort of the quick fix. And I won't get into all the details of all of it, but there's a lot of EU companies and sort of privacy advocates that are still not happy with it and are still looking to force more strict regulation for the U.S. and in the U.S. So you just need to be wary of the fact that that's out there. And if you're working with a company that does have a presence in the EU and is collecting that information, or even doesn't, but is somehow getting EU citizen information, make sure you engage somebody who really understands those laws and can help you navigate that, because somebody may dime out your company and then it may not be pretty.
Yeah, and at least for now too, I also know I've seen where it's depending on what country within the EU are stricter or interpreting things by, I don't want to say by the book, but with a more strict guideline, I know, and have additional privacy laws that are above and beyond what's currently in the EU. And I do know they went, if I'm not mistaken, they passed the final version of the EU data regulation that's supposed to go into effect in a couple of years as well, which is will try to simplify some things, but that still, I think, is at least, what, a year and a half out?
Oh yeah, nothing moves very quickly, but right now it's still a minefield that is sort of difficult to navigate. And I just go back to what I said earlier. If companies aren't even doing the basics with cybersecurity, then this is just one more thing that they'll either be frustrated over or completely ignore, depending on who they are. But it could get you stung if you're not careful.
Okay. Mark, a question for you. How can the security team better own risk and governance to prevent future breaches?
Well, first of all, you have to understand your system. You have to understand what you're trying to protect, and to what level you need to protect it. And then you have to also understand what's going to be the cost if there is a breach. That helps you at least determine what level of protection you should put in. It doesn't make sense to put in $100,000 worth of protection to protect $10,000 worth of information, unless there's a statutory reason to do so, of course. But understand what the laws are. Understand that some of the laws are kind of ambiguous, so you have to get interpretations of them. Many companies have legal representation you can go to. Some of them might actually understand the cyber aspects of it. It is kind of a niche, I think, in the legal area because it is still relatively new and becoming more important. But you have to understand your system and what will happen if there is a breach in either confidentiality, integrity, or the availability. And then using that, you can better recommend the types of protections that need to be put forward.
Okay, thanks. Dave, do you have anything else to add to that, or?
Yeah, real quick. The like Mark was saying, you have to understand both the law and the technical aspects, and that's not to say you have to go out and get a law degree, but even though you see a lot of law firms now saying, "Oh, we have our cyber section," most of the attorneys out there are not focusing on law and the technology. They're still really looking at the law, looking at contracts, internet legalities, things like that. They're not, they don't understand the technology to the point of being able to bridge the gap between the law and technology. So when you go and speak to the attorneys, make sure you understand that they don't really fully understand, for the most part, the technical aspects. They understand the law, and they may have some what they believe is good understanding of the technical aspects, but you really have to walk them through that. And the best example I can give is, like I said, when I was at NSA, I was very new to the technology. So a lot of the operators and intel analysts, I'd have to tell them, okay, walk me through so I can understand this. So don't make any assumptions that the legal people you're talking to understand that unless they speak the language and can show to you that they do understand exactly what you're talking about, because you need a good interpretation of that law as compared to the technology that you're dealing with.
Okay. I'll throw this next question out to both of you, and I'm sure you both have opinions on it. From a legal risk and liability perspective, what are most companies today just failing to do?
Well, this is Mark. Typically, we find that most companies that are breached is because there's been a vulnerability identified for 6 months or more that hasn't been patched. So if companies want to protect themselves, they need to stay up with the ever-changing threatscape and maintain their systems so that they can protect their data.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And what I've seen is that, and let me give you a scenario. Um, the cybersecurity sort of experts field, as far as I'm concerned, is relatively new. And a lot of companies, or most companies, when cybersecurity started to kick off, basically looked to the IT people and said, hey, you got to secure this network as well as set it up and maintain it. It's a computer. That's your job. Make it happen. And the IT people were like, okay, well, some of them were like, I am Superman. I can do it all. I can write your website and write up patents and design your computers. I can do everything. That was a little unrealistic. Other people are like, wow, you just piled a whole nother job on top of me. Am I going to get more money or more help? Now you're starting to see the cybersecurity expert positions show up in companies, but it's not very prevalent right now. And so it's been piled on top. And a lot of the companies that I've dealt with, it was an extra duty. And so on top of being help desk, maintaining uptime, all the employees' issues with all their computers, the updates and upgrades were an afterthought. And excuse me. And so sandboxing wasn't occurring. Um, a lot of the things that need to happen to keep the network secure was not happening. It's easy on your home computer because that happens automatically, and for most part, you have very few glitches when Microsoft or whoever updates your home computer. But on a company network, you have to check it out first and sandbox it and make sure no conflicts, all that kind of stuff, and that adds so much more work. And if the people responsible for that haven't been able to convince management that they need a whole nother group of people to handle that, then it's overload for the people responsible for that.
Okay. Mark, I'll go back to you. What do you think is the most important thing for someone that's just entering the cybersecurity field or going into their first cyber job to know about laws and regulations that may apply to the field or even industry vertical that they're in?
Well, first of all, don't assume that you know everything. I've seen people fail spectacularly that way. Don't be afraid to ask for advice, particularly legal advice, because well, with the interpretations of the laws, things that you would think would happen may not happen quite the way you think they should, but they happen the way they do. So, you have to be aware there are things that will get your hand slapped. And you also have to be aware that, well, there are things that can happen that will have the U.S. Marshal knocking at your door. You need to know which are which, and you have to be careful. There are a few things where you can get into really bad legal trouble. One of which is if you're looking through a system, legitimately because you're supposed to, and you find something that looks like child pornography, you stop right there. You don't report it to the people you're working for. You report it to law enforcement. Then I'd go back and brief the people you're working for after you've isolated that system and tell them, by the way, the law enforcement's going to be here because I think I found child pornography. And that works pretty much worldwide. In the European countries, some of the differences is that their definition of what is a child can change from location to location. So you have to be aware of your local information then too. One of the other areas is in penetration testing. How far can you go, and do you have a letter of authorization to go that far? Because the difference between penetration testing and hacking is a very thin line. And if you cross that line, it's hard to get back, and they can't come back on you for it. And then the third area is if you happen to be doing an incident investigation and the chain of custody, you have to know how to do that right. Call on somebody who has expertise in it until you learn it really well, because nothing's worse than going to court and having everything thrown out because you didn't do it right. Those are the things that they need to be aware of. And over time they'll begin to pick up some of that information and probably get certifications in things that will cover it, or read up more on the laws, talking with other people at conferences. It just takes time to pick up all the little nuances.
Okay, I'll just add a comment there, and Dave, you can feel free to chime in, from your end then. But I think too, we've got, as this next generation comes into cybersecurity, they've had access to resources that none of us have had access to growing up. Everything's online. I can get, where the books on law were only available through expensive books or in a library. You can pull up anything and everything, every court case known to man, right on the internet. And to know if you're not an attorney, you're not an attorney. And if you don't have, you can only learn so much. You need to know when to consult for legal help. And reach out, within your organizations to, the appropriate channels there. Dave, you want to comment any more in relation to that, or what you feel is the most important thing for someone starting out to know about laws and regs?
Yeah, real quick, I want to echo what Mark was saying about the child porn. When you're dealing with child porn, it's not like someone found drugs in somebody else's pocket or something like that. It's typically going to be on the network. Only stupid child porn people will put that stuff on their own drive or on their own computer. So they're going to hide it on the network somewhere. And you don't know whether that showed up because somebody within the company put it there, a hacker has broken into the network and put it there. So at this point, when you find that, it's toxic. So you need to call law enforcement right away and maybe even do a memo of, okay, this is what I was doing, it was this day, this time, this is where I was looking, and this is what I found. And then preserve that, because when law enforcement comes in, whether you like it or not, and you could be Mary Sister Teresa. When they come in, everybody's a suspect. So they're going to be looking at and following the evidence, and you don't want that stuff touching you at all. That's why I said it's toxic. Toxic. So a lot of times you'll get people within the organizations, oh, just get rid of it. We don't need that publicity, or we don't know who it is, or what have you. You don't want it, because if it comes back, it's going to come back and bite you. And I can tell you, from defending and prosecuting in the military, usually it wasn't the original crime that got most people in trouble. It was the cover-up after the fact that got them in trouble. So don't do that.
Yeah, one other thing, if you happen to come across something that looks like child pornography, stop right there. Don't look to see if there's another. If you look for another, now you can be, part of the problem. So, if you find one, call somebody in to check it.
Yeah, I agree. And I know if you have another thing, I think you probably would both agree on. Don't be thinking that, oh, I better make a copy of this, so we have a backup of it. No, leave it alone. All right, David, I think you mentioned a couple times during this webinar about hackbacks. Maybe you want to give some thoughts regarding, can a company, do they have a right to, if they're getting hacked, if somebody's launching a denial of service attack against the organization, do they have a right to go back and try to take out the source?
Okay, Mark, here we go.
I set you guys up.
Yeah.
Yeah, it depends.
Yeah. Okay, let me start with a little background. And there's only 3 attorneys that I know of. One of them being myself, that would say you can legally do hackback. And this is just from having spoken at them at conferences. One is Stuart Baker from the law firm in D.C. The other one is Steve Chabinsky, who's with CrowdStrike, who used to be an FBI attorney. And we've discussed this. I was speaking at a conference. This was a private session right before RSA a few years back. And after discussing hackback, a couple of the participants came up to me afterwards and said to me that their company went outside the U.S. If they were breached, they would engage in hackback to go find the hackers and hunt them down and see if they could get their information back or what have you. And this one guy told me he worked for a very large hotel chain. And while they were doing this, they disrupted a Secret Service investigation. And he didn't go into, oh, then we all got arrested or we all got in trouble or what have you. But the impression that I got from these discussions over the years is that hackback is going on, but it's going on from the perspective of whoever's involved with it, the IT department or whoever, in the basement, and either management knows about it or they don't. If they do, their response is, well, if it all goes bad, I don't want to know about it. But just keep it quiet. Or like we had a contractor in the government many years ago who was mad about the government being hacked, went home one night and decided he was going to figure out who they were on his own. And that didn't turn out very well for him. And so what I did was start writing and speaking on this and put what I believe is a good process involved. And you need, obviously, the legal expert, malware expert, somebody who knows about intrusion detection, traceback. You need to line up a team of the experts that you have. And then the most important part is the leadership of the company has to be on board, because depending on what you do, there's probably going to be lawsuits after the fact. And you need to be able to go into this with everything documented and say, here's what we did, how we did it, and we made the decisions based on our loss or what was going on in our company, that this was something we had to do to protect the company as the leadership, we had a fiduciary responsibility. And then you go through and you start analyzing, and it's like a military operation. You try and collect the intel, you analyze what you have, you figure out your next course of action, and the leadership says, okay, we're comfortable with that, move forward. And then so on, and you take it step by step like that. And as I've spoken on this over the years, and Mark knows, I get all kinds of people throwing stuff out at me. And I'll get rid of the first most ridiculous question or response that I get is, well, you'll start a war with China. Okay, if we were going to start a war with China because we hacked them, then it would have started, because they hack us, we hack them, private citizens hack them, companies, there's hacking going on all around. If that was going to happen, it would have started a long time ago. Now to a few of the more legitimate arguments. Again, people say it's illegal, you can't do it. It depends on what you're doing and how you're doing it. Let's say somebody, and oh, here's one of the good ones as well. You will impact an innocent bystander. And the way I resolve that is, first of all, if you're a company and your server has been breached and is being used to attack me, you are no longer an innocent bystander. You're a victim like me, but you're not innocent. You allowed your server to be breached, and you may know it or you may not know it. Based on what I'm seeing with these class action suits, typically it got breached because you weren't doing something correctly, and it wasn't some obscure thing that nobody else knows. It probably had to do a lot with basics. And so if I'm able to do traceback and figure out it belongs to XYZ and company, and I call the CEO, and the CEO says, well, you know, how do you know it's us? I give him the evidence. He says, oh, I don't care. If you do anything, we're going to sue you. My response to him would be, first of all, you now know that you're impacting me, so I have a suit against you. And second of all, hackers don't typically compromise a server to attack one company. If that server is compromised and being used to attack, there's probably hundreds of companies that they're attacking. And I would tell the guy, you know, maybe we should just go find those other companies and tell all of them that your server's attacking them as well. And that'll probably persuade them to want to work with you. But again, this is getting management involved to help you deal with the issue. And finally, if that person says, no, sorry, you're wrong, I'm not going to help you, you're on your own, and you're still suffering, and it has to be a continuing breach, not a one-time hit. Like if somebody comes up to you and punches you in the face and runs away, you don't legally have the right to chase them down the street and beat them up. If they're continuing to punch you, you can defend yourself. So the breach has to be continuing, and the best scenario I have, and it's kind of old, but one of the Zeus botnets, when scrubbed from a network, when you rebooted the network, my understanding is it would reboot itself, and hackers also would use different lines of communication in order to reconnect with that botnet to send instructions to it. So you could have a persistent attack via that means, and a lot of others. But let's say the server owner says, sorry, I'm not going to help you, and you're still suffering, you're losing money, your network's being damaged, or your intellectual property is being siphoned out, then at some point the leadership may say, well, we have to take action, we have to protect this company, so we're going to take them offline, and then we'll see them in court. So that's sort of my quick down and dirty on hackback and some of the legalities. And I get all kinds of good arguments, and we get into yelling matches. It's a lot of fun.
All right, we'll throw it over to Mark.
Okay, what was the question again?
Basically, what your thoughts on the legalities of hacking back?
Okay, hacking back, you know, I've talked with David on this many times. We've had some very interesting discussions. And as he says, there may be occasions when you want to do that, but generally, particularly for the new person, if you're going to do that, you better get something in writing from somebody in authority. And I'm not talking about your line supervisor to do that. I'm talking about somebody from the C level who has the authority to authorize you to do that, or they're just going to come back at you as a hacker.
Yeah, and as I mentioned in the beginning, this is not typically someone in the IT department or network department that's going to do this. You're going to bring in a specialized team of experts, and some of those experts may be within your organization, but you need that full team to come in, and they have to convince the management first. Here's our processes, here's how we go through it, and here's the steps we take, and when we need your input and your authorization. So it's not it's not the in the basement, let's see if we can get these suckers type of thing.
Okay. At this point, I don't have any additional questions popping up on my screen here from the audience. So I'll open it up to the two of you. If you have any, maybe final thoughts or advice to our, folks out there on the line as they, are looking to enter the field.
One of the things that I would advise them is get involved with some professional associations. Of course, a little biased toward ISSA, having been a member for a long time, but it is one of the better professional organizations because typically when you go to a meeting, nobody wears their company colors. We just talk cybersecurity. We talk about the problems, the threats, the answers that might work and why they will, why they won't, and try to stay up with changes in technology. And that's the best thing you could do is just learn from the people that have been there before. I always say don't make my mistakes. Go out and make your own. Over to you, Dave.
Yeah, one of the areas that really gotten into was the incident response. I'm seeing a lot of companies that don't have incident response plans and haven't exercised them. So if you're new, first of all, when you get to the company, I would ask them, hey, what policies for cybersecurity do you have in place? What are the guidelines? Is there an incident response plan, a data retention plan, things like that? And if they don't have them, or people say, well, I'll have to go look for it, or it doesn't look like it's something that anybody's read anytime soon, and I would be the champion and say, hey, what if XYZ happens? And I don't think there's a company out there that can say right now that they've never suffered a breach or never had some sort of cyber or technical issue pop up. And a lot of them still, they're just playing fast and loose and hanging on by a thread. And if they have a major breach, they're not going to know what to do. And it's not just incident response from the perspective of, okay, how are we going to do the forensic investigation? You have to think through all the pieces and aspects of it. Like, first of all, if the breach gets out and goes public, the leadership's going to have to answer to shareholders and clients and customers and the media. So do they have a prepared statement to talk about that? And a prepared statement in the beginning, it won't match the breach exactly, but at least they have something in writing and they can quickly adjust it to what's going on at the time, rather than, as you've seen with a lot of these high-profile data breaches, somebody comes out and says something and it comes across as pretty stupid, or they say, oh, it wasn't that bad, it was only 30,000 people, and then a few months later it's in the millions, and they're really looking bad. The other thing is, who are they going to call? When are they going to call them? At what point do they get law enforcement involved? All kinds of aspects like that a lot of companies aren't thinking through, and so it's a knee-jerk reaction. And typically, if you have a breach and you're a small or medium-sized company and you haven't worked through this, a lot of people say, oh, well, if you're do forensic examinations, a lot of people say, oh, put your information out on the website or something like that. But if you're a small or medium-sized company, you're not typically going to go to Google and say, okay, I've been breached, let me figure out which company I go with. It's usually, oh, I've heard of this company, or somebody recommends that person to you. It would be much better to say, I've talked to this company and I know they can help me if something like this happens, and I'm comfortable with them. That way you've covered all your bases, you're ready to move forward, and you look like you know what you're doing versus you're scrambling and making mistakes and things like that. So try and be the champion to make sure the policies are in place and they're read, and the incident response plans, and so on and so forth, so everybody knows what to do and when.
And one of the things that I think the entry-level person or a person new to cybersecurity could really benefit from is just tabletop discussions. You know, get some of your peers together and do the what if game. You know, well, what if this happens? And somebody will say, well, that can't happen because we have this in place, which means they have no contingency for that occurrence then. So you have to look at everything that can go wrong, because just because you have put protections in place doesn't mean they won't be breached, doesn't mean they won't fail. So, you know, just doing the what if and the thinking ahead, and then writing some notes down if nothing else. It's better to have actual plans where you can go to them, but just sitting around and talking about it. It's not being a bad guy, but it's thinking like a bad guy. And that becomes, you know, a very good strategy in planning out your protection methods for your system.
Yeah, and let me add to that real quick. One of the things is if the leadership is making a decision about cybersecurity and implementing, and they've made a good business decision, then they can live with that and defend it all day long. And a good example is with the Home Depot breach. What I heard was at some point they turned off part of their security and they were breached. Now, if they did that because it was the business decision and they said, we've got to do this because of X, Y, and Z, well, then that's something they can defend. And they say, well, we didn't anticipate getting breached, but we had to shut this down because it was conflicting or something like that. But on the other hand, if it was the IT department or somebody said, oh, I can't stand that alarm anymore, just shut it off, that's not a good business decision. And a good example is a friend of mine was doing a security assessment, and they were going through doors, and he was looking up at the camera, and the alarm kept going off. And then while he was standing in the control monitoring room, that alarm kept going off, and he noticed one of the people in there say, oh, I can't stand that thing, just shut it off. So they weren't investigating it, they were just annoyed by it and shut it off, and it could have been something significant. So as long as it's a clear and valid business decision, then you can defend and justify that. If it's just, I'm annoyed, I don't want to be bothered, then that's not the road to go down.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to take this time to thank both of you, Mark and David, for your wonderful insight and for participating on today's webinar. I'd also like to thank our audience out there for attending today. Post-event evaluation form can be found on the comments section. Please just complete the form to enter to win an Amazon gift card, and we appreciate your feedback for future events like this. If you have any additional questions you'd like to ask any of the speakers on the webinar today, please feel free to contact Leah Lewis at Lewis, LLEWIS, at ISSA.org. And for more information on ISSA's Cybersecurity Career Lifecycle, please visit www.issa.org. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.